the watch officer aboard the German merchant freighter SS Benno stood on the bridge wing, scanning the black ocean with binoculars he couldn't really use in the darkness. The Atlantic stretched endless and empty in every direction, lit only by a sliver of moon breaking occasionally through racing clouds. Behind him, the ship's captain was drinking coffee in the chart room, confident in the protection of their escort, a Type 7 U-boat running submerged somewhere ahead. The watch officer lowered his binoculars and lit a cigarette, cupping the flame carefully. He was thinking about home, about Hamburg, about whether his family had survived the latest bombing raid. He wasn't thinking about American submarines. Nobody worried about American submarines. The Americans were new to this war, inexperienced, equipped with boats that the Kriegsmarine considered inferior in every measurable way. German U-boats had been hunting Allied shipping since 1939, perfecting their tactics, dominating the Atlantic. American submarines were jokes, toys, machines built by a nation that didn't understand naval warfare. The torpedo struck without warning. The explosion tore through the Benno's engine room, killing the watch engineer instantly and rupturing the main steam line. The ship lurched violently to starboard. The watch officer was thrown against the bridge railing, his cigarette spinning away into the darkness. Before he could even shout a warning, a second torpedo hit amidships, this one detonating directly beneath the cargo hold, containing 200 tons of ammunition destined for the Eastern Front. The freighter didn't sink. It disintegrated. The explosion was visible for 20 miles, a fireball that climbed hundreds of feet into the night sky, turning darkness into daylight for a brief, terrible moment. Debris rained down across a square mile of ocean. Of the Benno's crew of 42 men, none survived. The German U-boat escort, running submerged 3 miles ahead, heard the explosions through their hull. They immediately went to battle stations, certain they were under attack by British destroyers or aircraft. They never imagined, not for a second, that an American submarine had just killed their convoy. 4,000 yards away, USS Tang sat motionless on the surface, her diesel silent, watching through the periscope as the fireball faded and debris continued to fall. Commander Richard O'Kane, one eye pressed to the scope's eyepiece, slowly rotated the periscope through a complete circle, scanning for threats, for escorts, for any indication that Tang had been detected. There was nothing, just darkness and the scattered wreckage of a ship that had been making 12 knots 30 seconds earlier. O'Kane stepped back from the periscope and nodded to his executive officer. "Take her down to 100 feet. Rig for silent running. Let's see if anyone comes looking for us." As Tang slipped beneath the surface, as her crew moved silently through their stations preparing for possible counterattack, none of them knew they were participating in the transformation of American submarine warfare from laughingstock to the most lethal undersea force the world had ever seen. They didn't know that within 2 years, American submarines would sink more enemy shipping than any submarine force in history. They didn't know that the German Kriegsmarine, which had spent the early war years dismissing American subs as inferior, would come to fear them more than any other threat except Allied air power. They only knew what they could prove with torpedoes and courage, and what they were about to prove would change naval warfare forever. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the American submarine force was not ready for war. The Navy had 111 submarines, a respectable number on paper, but the reality was far less impressive. Most were older designs, some dating back to World War I. The newer fleet submarines were untested in combat, their capabilities unknown, their tactics undeveloped. Worse, they were equipped with the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon that would prove to be one of the most catastrophic equipment failures in American military history. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be revolutionary. It ran deeper than earlier torpedoes, passing beneath enemy ships and detonating via a magnetic influence exploder that would break the ship's keel, the most catastrophic damage possible. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a disaster. The magnetic exploder often detonated prematurely, alerting targets without causing damage. The depth control was faulty, causing torpedoes to run too deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets. And the contact exploder, meant as a backup if the magnetic system failed, was so poorly designed that torpedoes often struck targets and failed to explode at all. American submarine commanders would spend the first 2 years of the war fighting not just the enemy, but their own equipment. They would fire torpedoes that exploded halfway to the target. They would achieve perfect attack positions, fire spreads of torpedoes, and watch in frustration as all of them passed beneath enemy ships without detonating. They would strike enemy vessels perfectly, hear the metallic clang of impact, and watch the torpedo sink harmlessly as the contact exploder failed. The psychological impact was devastating. Submarine warfare requires absolute confidence in your weapons. You spend weeks on patrol, enduring cramped quarters, stale air, terrible food, constant danger. When you finally achieve a perfect attack position after hours of careful maneuvering, when you fire your torpedoes at a target that doesn't know you're there, you need those torpedoes to work. When they don't, when they fail again and again, it destroys morale and makes commanders question their own competence. The Germans knew about these problems. Their intelligence services monitored American submarine operations, intercepted communications, debriefed crews from ships that had been attacked but survived. They knew American torpedoes were failing at catastrophic rates, and they laughed. In German naval bases from Kiel to Lorient, in U-boat briefings and naval staff meetings, American submarines were discussed with barely concealed contempt. The Americans didn't understand submarine warfare. Their boats were too large, too visible, too noisy. Their tactics were primitive. Their torpedoes didn't work. They were no threat. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong in 1942. American submarines were struggling. In the Pacific theater, where most American subs operated, early war patrols were marked by frustration and failure. Submarines would sight enemy convoys, achieve attack positions, fire multiple torpedoes, and accomplish nothing. The Mark 14 torpedo was failing so consistently that some submarine commanders began to doubt it could work at all. But the Germans made a crucial mistake. They confused early failure with permanent inferiority. They assumed American submarines would remain ineffective because they were ineffective now. They didn't account for what would happen when American industry, American innovation, and American determination focused on solving the torpedo problem and developing new tactics. The transformation began slowly, driven by submarine commanders who refused to accept failure. Men like Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, who took command of USS Wahoo in 1943 and revolutionized American submarine tactics. Morton was aggressive, where earlier commanders had been cautious. He attacked on the surface when possible, using Wahoo's deck gun to conserve torpedoes and achieve kills that faulty torpedoes couldn't. He developed the tactic of firing down the throat, launching torpedoes directly at approaching enemy ships, rather than trying for perfect broadside shots. He trained his crew relentlessly, turning Wahoo into the most efficient killing machine in the Pacific. Morton's success demonstrated that the problem wasn't American submarines or American submarine crews. The problem was tactics and equipment, and both could be fixed. The torpedo problem was finally solved through a combination of combat experience and scientific analysis. Submarine commanders began conducting their own tests, firing torpedoes at different depths and angles, documenting every failure, building evidence that the Mark 14's problems were systematic rather than random. By mid-1943, the Navy finally acknowledged the depth control problem and issued new settings. By late 1943, The magnetic exploder was deactivated fleet-wide after continued failures. And by early 1944, the contact exploder had been redesigned to actually detonate on impact. These fixes transformed American submarine effectiveness overnight. Suddenly, torpedoes fired from American submarines hit their targets and exploded. Attack positions that would have produced nothing in 1942 now produced sinkings. The submarines themselves hadn't changed. The crews hadn't suddenly become more skilled. But the weapons finally worked. And that changed everything. The boats themselves were also better than the Germans had understood. American fleet submarines were large compared to German U-boats, displacing over 1,500 tons on the surface versus about 750 tons for a Type 7 U-boat. The Germans interpreted this as a weakness, assuming larger submarines would be easier to detect and less maneuverable. But the size brought advantages the Germans hadn't considered. American submarines were more comfortable, with better crew quarters, more provisions storage, superior habitability. They could remain on patrol for months, far longer than German U-boats. They had greater range, allowing them to operate in distant waters without refueling. And they carried more torpedoes, typically 24 versus 14 for a German U-boat, meaning they could conduct more attacks per patrol. American submarines also incorporated technologies that German boats lacked. They had air conditioning, crucial for operations in tropical waters, that kept equipment functional and crews effective. They had superior fire control computers that calculated torpedo firing solutions faster and more accurately than German mechanical calculators. They had better periscopes with greater magnification and clearer optics, and increasingly they had radar, allowing them to detect enemy ships at night or in poor weather when visual detection was impossible. By 1944, American submarines were the most capable undersea vessels in the world, and their commanders were developing tactics that even the Germans, with their years of experience, hadn't imagined. Richard Hetherington O'Kane was 31 years old when he took command of USS Tang in October 1943. He was a perfectionist, demanding, sometimes harsh with his crew, but absolutely brilliant as a submarine commander. He had served as executive officer aboard USS Wahoo under Mush Morton, learning aggressive tactics and developing an almost instinctive understanding of submarine warfare. When he received his own command, he was determined to prove that American submarines could be more than just effective. They could be devastating. Tang was a Ballo-class submarine, one of the newest designs in the American fleet. She displaced 1,526 tons surfaced, 2,424 tons submerged. She was 311 feet long, could make 20 knots on the surface, and 8 knots submerged. She carried 24 torpedoes and a 5-inch deck gun. On paper, she was an excellent submarine. Under O'Kane's command, she would become legendary. O'Kane's approach to submarine warfare was methodical but aggressive. He drilled his crew constantly, running practice approaches and attack drills until every man could perform his duties perfectly, even under stress. He studied enemy convoy tactics, learning how Japanese merchant ships traveled, how their escorts operated, where their weaknesses were. He developed an almost supernatural ability to predict enemy movements, to position Tang perfectly for attacks, to fire torpedoes that hit exactly where he intended. But what made O'Kane truly dangerous was his willingness to take risks that other commanders avoided. He would attack heavily escorted convoys that other submarines might have bypassed. He would surface in the middle of enemy formations to fire point blank. He would remain in attack zones far longer than doctrine recommended, waiting for perfect shots rather than firing hurriedly and escaping. His crew called him fearless. His fellow commanders called him reckless. His results called him brilliant. Tang's first war patrol, beginning in January 1944, established O'Kane's reputation. Operating in the waters around the Caroline Islands, Tang sank 5 Japanese merchant ships totaling 20,000 tons. The 5th kill demonstrated O'Kane's tactical genius and absolute nerve. Tang had been tracking a convoy for 2 days, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. O'Kane positioned Tang ahead of the convoy's track, then surfaced in darkness directly in their path. As the convoy approached, Tang sat motionless on the surface, invisible against the dark ocean, allowing the ships to come within 1,000 yards before firing. The first torpedo struck the lead merchant ship in her forward hold. The second hit amidships. The third struck just forward of the stern. The ship, a 7,000-ton freighter carrying troops and supplies, broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. Tang immediately targeted the second ship in line, firing 3 more torpedoes. 2 hit, and the ship began to settle by the stern, her crew abandoning ship. O'Kane then did something that shocked even his own crew. Instead of diving to escape the escort vessels that were certainly coming, he ordered Tang to remain surfaced, turned toward the 3rd merchant ship, and continued attacking. By the time Tang finally dove and cleared the area, 3 ships were sinking, and the convoy was in chaos. The escort vessels, small patrol craft that lacked sophisticated anti-submarine equipment, never detected Tang. O'Kane had struck with perfect precision and escaped without even being threatened. Tang's subsequent patrols were even more successful. On her 2nd patrol, she sank 10 ships. On her 3rd, she sank 7. On her 4th, she sank 13. The numbers were unprecedented. No American submarine had ever achieved such consistent, devastating success. O'Kane was doing things that submarine commanders didn't think were possible, but it wasn't just O'Kane and Tang. Across the Pacific, American submarines were transforming from ineffective raiders into the most lethal anti-shipping force in naval history. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, conducted attacks so aggressive they bordered on suicidal. Fluckey would surface among enemy convoys and engage with deck guns. He would penetrate harbours thought to be impregnable. On one patrol, Barb sank 17 ships, an achievement that earned Fluckey the Medal of Honor. USS Wahoo, under Mush Morton, until her loss in October 1943, had pioneered the aggressive surface attacks that became standard American tactics. Morton had proven that American submarines didn't need to hide and attack cautiously. They could hunt openly, surface in the middle of enemy waters, and dominate through speed and firepower. USS Trigger, under Commander Robert Benson, developed the tactic of following enemy convoys for days, attacking multiple times from different angles, refusing to be driven off by escorts. Trigger once pursued a single convoy for 5 days, attacking on 3 separate occasions, sinking 4 ships and damaging 3 more. These commanders were proving that American submarines could do more than sink ships. They could terrorize entire ocean regions. They could make enemy waters unsafe for any vessel. They could blockade nations. And the Germans were beginning to notice. By mid-1944, German naval intelligence was receiving disturbing reports from their Japanese allies. American submarine activity in the Pacific had increased dramatically. Japanese merchant shipping losses were catastrophic. Entire convoys were being wiped out. Japanese naval communications, intercepted and decoded by German intelligence, revealed growing panic about American submarine capabilities. The Germans had their own problems with Allied submarines in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. British submarines had been effective throughout the war, but the reports from the Pacific suggested something different. The Americans weren't just effective, they were dominant. They were conducting operations that German U-boat commanders, with all their experience, couldn't match. A captured document from a Japanese destroyer escort, seized when the vessel was sunk by USS Tang in July 1944, provided detailed observations of American submarine tactics. The document, translated by German naval intelligence and distributed to U-boat training schools, acknowledged American superiority in several critical areas. American submarines attacked at night on the surface, using radar to detect targets before being detected themselves. They fired torpedoes from closer ranges than doctrine suggested, ensuring hits. They didn't withdraw after initial attacks but remained in the area, striking repeatedly. Their torpedoes, which had been unreliable in 1942, now worked with devastating consistency. The tone of the document was remarkable. Japanese naval officers were writing with grudging respect about an enemy they had dismissed 2 years earlier. They acknowledged that American submarine commanders showed exceptional skill and courage. They noted that American crews were well-trained and effective. They recommended extreme caution when operating in waters where American submarines might be present. When this document reached German naval headquarters, the reaction was sobering. If the Americans had developed submarine tactics that impressed even the Japanese, who had been fighting them for 3 years, then American submarines were no longer jokes. They were threats. And not just to the Japanese. If American submarines ever operated in significant numbers in the Atlantic or Mediterranean, they would be formidable opponents. In U-boat training lectures at Kiel and Lorient, instructors began including sections on American submarine capabilities. Trainees were warned not to underestimate American boats. They were shown recognition charts identifying American submarine classes. They were taught that American submarines operated differently than British boats, more aggressively, more willing to surface and fight. But these warnings came too late to matter. By late 1944, American submarines had already won the war in the Pacific. Japanese merchant shipping, once numbering thousands of vessels, had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Japan's economy was strangling. Oil tankers couldn't reach the home islands. Troop transports couldn't supply island garrisons. Food shipments from Southeast Asia were being intercepted and sunk. American submarines, operating in wolf packs or alone, had achieved what battleships and aircraft carriers couldn't. They had cut Japan's maritime lifelines completely. The statistics told a story of absolute dominance. In 1944 alone, American submarines sank 603 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 2.7 million tons. They also sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and 30 destroyers. They rescued downed Allied pilots, conducted reconnaissance missions, landed commandos on enemy-held islands, and evacuated civilians from danger zones. They operated with near impunity in waters that should have been deadly for submarines. And they did it with a force that never exceeded 250 boats operating simultaneously. By comparison, the German U-boat force at its peak had numbered over 400 boats. Yet German U-boats never achieved the consistent, devastating success that American submarines achieved. The reasons were complex. American submarines operated primarily against Japanese merchant shipping, which was less heavily protected than Allied convoys in the Atlantic. American submarines had technological advantages that German U-boats lacked, and American submarine tactics emphasized aggression and persistence that German doctrine didn't match. But there was something else, something the Germans only gradually came to understand. American submarines weren't just weapons. They were manifestations of American industrial and organizational capability. Every American submarine represented not just a fighting vessel, but an entire support system. American submarines had reliable torpedoes because American scientists had solved the technical problems. They had sophisticated electronics because American industry could mass-produce precision equipment. They had well-trained crews because America had the resources to conduct extensive training programs. German U-boats, by contrast, were increasingly operating without adequate support. By 1944, German submarines were suffering from fuel shortages, maintenance problems, crew training deficiencies. German torpedoes, once considered superior to anything the Allies had, were becoming less reliable as quality control deteriorated. German submarine commanders were being sent to sea with inadequate preparation because the training program couldn't keep pace with losses. The Americans had advantages the Germans couldn't match, and those advantages were decisive. USS Tang's final patrol began on September 24, 1944. It would be her fifth war patrol, and it would establish records that would stand for decades. It would also end in tragedy that would become one of the most dramatic stories in submarine warfare history. Tang was assigned to patrol the waters around Formosa, modern Taiwan, and the northern Philippine Sea. These were heavily travelled waters, with Japanese convoys moving supplies and troops between Japan, China, and the Philippines. They were also dangerous waters, heavily patrolled by Japanese anti-submarine forces, with air cover from nearby bases. O'Kane planned to make this patrol Tang's most successful. He had refined his tactics over 4 previous patrols. He knew his crew's capabilities. He trusted his equipment. He was hunting with confidence and skill that came from proven success. The patrol began well. On October 10th, Tang sank a 6,800-ton transport carrying troops from Japan to the Philippines. On October 11th, she sank a 10,000-ton tanker loaded with aviation fuel. On October 23rd, she attacked a heavily escorted convoy, sinking 4 ships in a single night engagement that lasted 3 hours and required O'Kane to maneuver through a formation of 9 escort vessels. By October 24th, Tang had sunk 9 ships. She had 2 torpedoes remaining. That evening, Tang detected a 5-ship convoy northwest of Formosa. O'Kane decided to attack despite having only 2 torpedoes left. His reasoning was simple. 2 torpedoes meant 2 targets, and he wasn't going to waste an opportunity just because he was low on ammunition. Tang approached on the surface in darkness, using radar to track the convoy. O'Kane positioned Tang ahead of the convoy's track, then waited. As the convoy approached, he identified 2 large transports, both over 7,000 tons, perfect targets for his last 2 torpedoes. At 2,000 yards, O'Kane gave the order to fire. The first torpedo was launched from the forward tubes, aimed at the lead transport. It was perfectly set, speed and angle calculated precisely. The torpedo ran straight and true, striking the transport just forward of amidships. The explosion was massive. The transport broke in half. O'Kane immediately ordered the second torpedo fired at the trailing transport. This torpedo was also perfectly aimed. It should have struck the target exactly where O'Kane intended. But something went wrong. The torpedo ran normally for the first few hundred yards. Then, for reasons that were never fully determined, it malfunctioned. Instead of continuing straight, it curved. The circular run, every submariner's nightmare, a torpedo malfunction that causes the weapon to circle back toward its own submarine. O'Kane saw it through the periscope. He saw the torpedo's wake curving back toward Tang. He had perhaps 20 seconds. He ordered full power, hard right rudder. Tang's diesels screamed as her propellers bit into the water. The submarine began to turn, but she was too close. The turning radius was too wide. The torpedo was too fast. The torpedo struck Tang in the stern, just aft of the maneuvering room. The explosion tore open the hull, flooded the after compartments instantly, and drove the submarine down by the stern. Tang sank in less than 30 seconds. Of the 87 men aboard Tang when she was struck, 78 died instantly or went down with the boat. 9 men, including O'Kane, were on the bridge when Tang was hit. They were thrown into the water as the submarine sank beneath them. Over the next hours, 5 more men would escape from Tang's forward torpedo room using the Momsen lung, a primitive breathing apparatus designed for emergency submarine escapes. These men, along with O'Kane and 3 other survivors from the bridge, would spend the next 10 hours in the water before being rescued by a Japanese escort vessel from the convoy Tang had been attacking. Tang came to rest in 180 feet of water. 78 men were entombed inside her hull. She had sunk more enemy shipping than any other American submarine in World War II. 24 Japanese ships totaling over 100,000 tons. She had conducted 5 war patrols, each one devastatingly successful, and she had been killed by her own torpedo, a malfunction so rare it was almost unheard of. O'Kane and the other survivors were taken prisoner and held in brutal conditions until the war's end in August 1945. They survived interrogation, starvation rations, and the constant threat of execution. When they were finally liberated, O'Kane learned that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor for Tang's final patrol, for sinking more ships in a single patrol than any other submarine commander in American history. Tang's loss was tragedy, but her achievements established a standard that would define American submarine warfare for decades. O'Kane had proven that American submarines could dominate any waters they operated in. He had shown that aggressive tactics, skilled crews, and reliable equipment could overcome any enemy. And he had done it against opponents who had started the war believing American submarines were inferior. The Germans never faced Tang. She operated exclusively in the Pacific, hunting Japanese shipping, never entering the Atlantic where German vessels might have encountered her. But German naval intelligence knew about her. They knew about her success. They knew about O'Kane, and they knew what Tang represented. American submarine warfare had evolved from ineffective to unstoppable. The final statistics of American submarine warfare in World War II tell a story that contradicts every German assumption from 1941. American submarines sank 1,314 enemy ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. This represented approximately 55% of all Japanese shipping losses during the war. It included 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 11 cruisers, numerous destroyers and submarines, and over 1,000 merchant vessels. American submarines strangled Japan's economy more effectively than strategic bombing or surface naval operations. The cost was high. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking over 3,500 men to their deaths. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any American military service in World War II, approximately 22% killed, a rate second only to German U-boat losses. But the achievements were decisive. By mid-1945, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to virtually nothing. Oil tankers couldn't reach the home islands. Food shipments from Southeast Asia had ceased. Industrial production was collapsing, not just from American bombing, but from lack of raw materials that could no longer be imported. Japan was being strangled, slowly but inevitably, by submarines that the German Navy had once dismissed as inferior. German naval officers, evaluating American submarine performance after the war, acknowledged what they had missed. American submarines had been underestimated because early performance didn't predict later effectiveness. The torpedo problems that plagued American submarines in 1942 had been solved by 1943. The tactical conservatism that limited early success had been replaced by aggressive doctrines developed by commanders like Morton, O'Kane, and Fluckey. The technological advantages that American submarines possessed had been fully exploited once the equipment worked properly. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat force and briefly Hitler's successor, was asked in post-war interrogation about American submarines. His response was remarkably candid. American submarines in the Pacific had achieved what German U-boats had never accomplished in the Atlantic. They had effectively ended enemy maritime trade. They had done it with fewer boats, in less time, and with greater efficiency than the much-celebrated German submarine campaign. This assessment wasn't comfortable for German naval officers to make. The U-boat force had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the weapon that had nearly won the war by strangling Britain's supply lines. But the U-boats had ultimately failed. They had been defeated by improving Allied anti-submarine tactics, by code breaking, by technology, by the sheer weight of Allied industrial production. By 1945, U-boat operations had become suicidal, with 3 out of 4 crewmen never returning from patrol. American submarines, by contrast, had succeeded. They had accomplished their strategic mission. They had destroyed enemy shipping faster than it could be replaced. They had achieved this despite operating in enemy-controlled waters, despite facing improving Japanese anti-submarine defenses, despite losses that would have broken less determined forces. The difference wasn't just technology or tactics, it was approach. German submarine warfare had been reactive, responding to Allied countermeasures with defensive adaptations. American submarine warfare had been proactive, constantly developing new tactics, constantly pushing technological improvements, constantly seeking ways to be more effective. German U-boat commanders operated under strict doctrine, following procedures developed before the war and modified only slowly. American submarine commanders operated with remarkable freedom, encouraged to develop their own tactics, rewarded for innovation and aggression. The result was a culture that produced commanders like O'Kane, Morton, and Fluckey, men who rewrote the rules of submarine warfare through demonstrated success. The German Navy had laughed at American submarines in 1941. By 1945, there was no laughter. There was only the sobering recognition that the Americans had built a submarine force that exceeded German achievements, that had won its war while the U-boats had lost theirs, and that had done it by transforming from ineffective to unstoppable in less than 3 years. The legacy of American submarine warfare in World War II extends beyond the statistics and the individual achievements. It represents a fundamental shift in how naval warfare was conducted and understood. Before World War II, submarines were considered auxiliary weapons, useful for reconnaissance and opportunistic attacks, but not capable of decisive strategic effect. The German U-boat campaign had challenged this assumption by nearly winning the Battle of the Atlantic through systematic attacks on Allied shipping. But the U-boats had ultimately failed, defeated by improving Allied countermeasures. American submarines proved that submarine warfare could achieve decisive strategic results. They didn't just attack enemy shipping opportunistically, they systematically destroyed Japan's maritime economy. They cut supply lines, isolated island garrisons, strangled industrial production. They achieved what surface fleets and strategic bombers struggled to accomplish. They made it impossible for Japan to continue fighting. This achievement came from the combination of several factors that the Germans had underestimated or misunderstood. First, American submarines were well-designed vessels that incorporated technologies and capabilities that German boats lacked. They were comfortable enough for extended patrols, powerful enough to engage surface targets with deck guns, fast enough to pursue and attack convoys, and equipped with radar and fire control systems that German submarines didn't have. Second, American torpedoes, once their teething problems were solved, worked reliably. The Mark 14 torpedo, after 2 years of fixes and modifications, became an effective weapon. American submarines could trust their torpedoes to hit and explode, eliminating the psychological burden that had plagued early war operations. Third, American submarine commanders developed aggressive tactics that maximized their advantages. They attacked on the surface whenever possible, using speed and radar. They penetrated enemy harbors and coastal waters that should have been too dangerous. They pursued targets relentlessly, refusing to be driven off by escorts or poor weather. Fourth, American submarine crews were well trained and effective. They could operate their boats at the edge of their capabilities, performing complex maneuvers, maintaining equipment under stress, fighting through fear and fatigue. The training program that produced these crews was intensive, comprehensive, and effective. And fifth, American industrial capacity ensured that submarines were properly supplied, maintained, and supported. Torpedoes were available in sufficient quantities. Spare parts could be obtained when needed. New boats replaced losses. The entire support system worked efficiently, keeping submarines operational and effective. The Germans had possessed some of these advantages early in the war. But by 1944, the German submarine campaign was collapsing under the weight of Allied countermeasures, declining training standards, equipment shortages, and deteriorating morale. American submarines, by contrast, were reaching peak effectiveness, just as German U-boats were being driven from the seas. The comparison was stark and undeniable. American submarines had succeeded where German U-boats had failed, and they had done it against opponents who had learned from years of fighting German submarines how to defend against undersea threats. In the end, the story of American submarine warfare in World War II is a story about transformation. It's about taking a weapon that didn't work, fixing it, and turning it into the most effective anti-shipping force in naval history. It's about commanders who refused to accept failure and crews who fought through equipment problems and doctrinal failures to prove what submarines could achieve. It's about innovation overcoming tradition, aggression defeating caution, and determination outlasting initial setbacks. When German sailors laughed at American submarines in 1941, they weren't entirely wrong. American submarines were ineffective. Their torpedoes didn't work. Their tactics were undeveloped. Their commanders were inexperienced. But the Germans made the mistake of believing that present failure predicted future performance. They didn't account for American capacity to learn, adapt, and improve. By 1944, no one was laughing. American submarines had become the most feared predators in the Pacific. They had sunk more enemy shipping than any submarine force in history. They had developed tactics that even experienced German naval officers acknowledged as superior. They had proven that submarines could win wars, not just influence them. The transformation took 3 years. 3 years of frustration, failure, adaptation, and ultimately triumph. 3 years during which submarine commanders like Morton and Dick O'Kane rewrote the rules of submarine warfare through proven success. 3 years during which American torpedoes went from catastrophic failures to reliable weapons. 3 years during which American submarines went from jokes to nightmares. USS Tang sits on the bottom of the Pacific, 180 feet down, a tomb for 78 men who died achieving what their enemies thought was impossible. Her wreck has never been disturbed. She remains there still, a monument to what American submarines accomplished and what it cost to accomplish it. Dick O'Kane survived the war, received the Medal of Honor, and lived until 1994. He spent his post-war years promoting submarine warfare and honoring the men who had served with him. He never forgot Tang's crew, never stopped advocating for submarine veterans, never stopped believing that aggressive tactics and skilled crews could overcome any obstacle. The Germans who had laughed at American submarines learned their lesson too late to matter. By the time they understood what American submarines had become, the war was already decided. Japan's merchant marine was destroyed. The sea lanes were controlled by American submarines that German sailors would never encounter, but whose success they couldn't ignore. In the black waters of the Atlantic, in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the transformation was complete. American submarines had gone from underestimated to unstoppable. They had proven that innovation, determination, and courage could overcome initial failure. They had shown that those who laughed at the beginning would be silent by the end. The submarines that were once dismissed as inferior had become the standard by which submarine warfare would be measured. The tactics developed by American commanders would be studied and copied by naval forces around the world. The achievements of boats like Tang, Wahoo, and Barb would inspire generations of submarine crews. And the lesson would endure. Never underestimate the capacity of a determined force to transform failure into victory, to learn from mistakes, to adapt and overcome. The Germans learned that lesson at terrible cost. American submarines taught it with torpedoes and courage, one sinking at a time until the message was impossible to ignore. The sea kept its secrets, but the submarines that hunted beneath its surface told a story that couldn't be hidden. A story of transformation, of determination, of ultimate triumph. A story that began with laughter and ended with respect born from fear. German sailors laughed at American submarines until those submarines sank them, and by then it was far too late.